My name is Alexandros Mistriotis. I'm an artist. I mainly work with text and images. In the last 10 years I've been working in theater and dance and in public space. I think that my first artistic language is poetry, even though I studied fine arts in France. And actually this relationship between images and text was always defining all my work. Through the years of my studies, I realized that this explosion of the digital age, the digitization of our reality actually, changed the way that I understood the importance of different art forms. And it was at that moment that I realized that theater and dance that were at the time less relevant in my view, they became more and more important because they were defending the uniqueness of the human presence and the impossibility to repeat, to quantify and to record. So that explains how I started working in theater and dance, at least why I had this desire. And then something else happened also, which is related to the fact that poetry and theater actually are the same thing. Actually, when we talk about this in Athens, it's even more easy, even more obvious to say, because tragic theater was just a type of poetry. It was a subgenre of poetry. So theater is poetic or it is not theater. So my work is always, regardless of what I do, about the expansion of poetry, going beyond words and sometimes, if possible, beyond everything which is sensible. So once again, it's like trying to make it vanish. Something which is poetry without being poetic is the best thing I can dream of. At the same time, when we go to this archaic moment, there is no difference, and this is very crucial for me, there's no difference between poetry, theater and theory. Because most of the philosophers in the beginning, they would rather call themselves as poets, more like poets than philosophers. That would mean nothing to them. Philosopher is like an innovation that comes really afterwards. And since Plato, in my sense, is a theater play writer, well, again, he's in the same realm of open meaning which is constantly trying to go further than itself, actually. So expanding the field of meaning, it's not about expanding poetry, it's poetry itself. The last few years, though, because all this crisis narrative that is not only about Athens, but it's about Europe and the world finally, because we live in a Eurocentric world, or at least at the end of the Eurocentric world, made me feel that I needed to react in a much more clear and direct way with the environment. So what happened is that I got out in the city, out in the public space, and I started reading buildings and roads. And then I realized that actually I was, in a way, hypertexting a public space. I was bringing up the stories that were related to specific objects, houses, churches. Anything was so meaningful. And actually, ever since, I'm struggling to bring back the complexity of space, which is actually, at the same time, archives of memory and experience. So one of the things that I do is that I walk through the city with people. The desire that makes me do it is a poetic desire, it's a desire to find poetry, but it is made with a lot of theory, a lot of history, a lot of elements that come from archaeology. In a sense, I'm trying to find poetry which is not poetic and theory which is not theoretic. So the funny thing is that all societal problems and even all personal problems could be explained and could be described through negotiations of time and space. And humanity has been trying constantly to go beyond, liberate itself, and resist to the limitations of time and space. So even the nature of text is about that, and even a smartphone is about that, and the house is about that, and the security problems in the political sphere is about that. And when the society has a radical problem with one of the citizens, what it does, it puts them into the prison, which is actually controlling in an absolute manner time and space. So in this fight, actually, the most problematic element is the body. So what we see in different cultures is that we try to go beyond the limitations of time and space, which means that we try to go beyond the body. And we can see that galloping towards a future where everything is becoming more and more abstract. The peculiar thing and the more sensitive dimension of the problem is the abstraction of our economical system, which is actually getting into a discussion that seems to be much more philosophical, theological, psychological, but actually it is very fundamental. So the abstraction of the banking system, where you can see now that in the beginning we had money that was creating a neutral space in order to realize and liberate value from relationships and make it much more volatile and dynamic, then slowly now with credit cards, money is becoming more and more immaterial. So if money is controlling most of our relationships, at least in theory, this is what it is supposed to do, not only to control, but we believe that the market will solve our problems. So I think that postmodernity is quite vulnerable because it wants to liberate itself from form, but at the same time it doesn't have for the time being tools to resist and control a very similar parallel path towards a totally abstracted factor, which is the market and money, which is becoming more and more efficiently liberated from time and space. And that means that actually the last obstacle to this abstraction of economy is our bodies. So in reality, our financial system is trying to get rid of our bodies, and so do we. Well, you know, Stigler also has talked about that in a rather more developed manner. For Bauman, it's just one step of thinking, but for Stigler, it is very central. Well, actually, what happens is that this defacement of culture and technology is something that happens quite regularly in human history, as we understand it, at least thus far. What happens is that now the time that we need in order to readjust seems not to be sufficient, because before the end of the actual crisis, the next one starts. So we are in a phase of acceleration, apparently. So it is clear that we can describe this problem as such. The problem is that it's just soothing. It's not about how can we do. So we could probably add just a little thing, which is that in fact it is always a problem of translation. Like the problems, I do not believe that they're fundamentally new. Actually, we are trying constantly to translate the current version of the problem into the actual context. So what we try to do is to liberate our understanding from the form of the problem, and we must try to see where it collides, it coincides with previous version of it. Modernity, though, has a problem with that, because it only believes that it is the best possible moment of humanity. So we're in the metaphysics of progress. So the lives of the people that lived in different paradigms of culture and civilization, they almost do not have plain complete lives. It's only us. And this doesn't happen only on the vertical level of linear time. This happens also in the parallel space environment. So different cultures are not listened to. So we are incapable of looking at ourselves from a different point of view. We are always confined within modernity. Modernity is the only one who has critical thought. So we would never trust any other one to provide a ground so that we can see ourselves. So for me, there is these two steps that we could probably add. First of all, doubting that there's something new about it and listening to the past so that we can accelerate the propositions that we will make. And the second thing is that we need to expand our understanding to different cultural paradigms that were really profoundly unwilling to listen. Now you open up another thing, but honestly, I think that since a lot of our listeners are more or less understanding this, for me it is much more important to add the importance of different cultures in order to understand the impasses that we have, because all societies have been dealing more or less with similar problems. One easy example is the interdiction, like the fact that in Islamic world and in all monotheistic, like even in Judaism, you're not allowed to create an image of God. Okay, this is a political tool that we should learn from, because we are living in a world where we are controlled by images and image making, and we only consider that as something like, I don't know, dark ages and stuff like that, which is totally wrong. Actually, we should learn from that and understand that he who controls the image, who is always a powerful, he has the ability to impose his understanding. So the absolute moral reference should be protected beyond the reach and the control. And the control is not only about executive power, it's about the power of images as well. And we can see it now clearly. You see, we only use Benjamin as the only reference which has some resources that come from the Judaic tradition. It's the only thinker that we are allowed to bring in the discussion. This is the correct thing. So whenever you have a small opening about some other more or less metaphysical, theological thought, the only space that we have available is once again Walter Benjamin. There is that book of Freud, the last book that he wrote, and it's Moses and Monotheism. And in that book, Freud himself, he says that there's no identity which is more closed than the Jewish one, okay? And while he says that, what he does in this book is that instead of going against, what he does is that he goes really into the bottom of it. And the conclusion is very shocking, because he says that actually, I believe that Moses was an Egyptian. So actually, the source of being a Jewish is another. So, and not just another, the hateful, the hated enemy. So, the source of my identity is the enemy. So, by doing so, what he does is that he finds the other within his own closed culture. Because if it is true what we believe, at least as contemporary people, that there's this otherness and that this closed space is impossible, even if we dug in a constructive way, not in order to accuse our fellow citizens that are living in a closed identity, with respect, and I would even say with tenderness, if we would dug into our culture, we would find the other, because he's all over the place. And I'm sure it's the same goes for my cultural identity. I'm sure that the same goes for the Polish case.